Good morning, Marist Grove, and welcome to today's edition of Through the Lens. I'm your host, Heather Baver, and we have a great topic today. We're going to be speaking with one of our upcoming lecturers, Rich Wagner, and I wanted to let you know that Rich will be back at Marist Grove on Thursday, September 27th at 2:30 p.m. to give his presentation. But right now, we're going to get to know a little bit about Rich. Rich, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being our guest today. So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you live now.
Well, I'm from Hatboro. I'm a lifelong resident of Hatboro, which is in Montgomery County, near the Willow Grove exit of the Turnpike. And I went into teaching. I taught school for 23 years and went for a career change. I went to brewing school. I brewed in some craft breweries in Philadelphia for about 7 years, and then right now I more or less do speaking engagements, and I do research on Pennsylvania breweries and also on colonial brewing.
So what motivated you to become a brewery historian? Well, that's an interesting career change from teaching.
Quite simply, it was an appreciation of the product, and like anything, when you start looking for something, you find things, and as far as research goes, sometimes I think I've fallen into a pit of quicksand because there's just so much there, and you know, and that's rewarding that you find so much stuff, but sometimes it can be overwhelming.
How do you do research? Where do you go for materials to learn about brewery?
Well, my initial research started out in 1980. A friend of mine and me and our girlfriends took a vacation, and we tried to go to all the breweries that were still in business in Pennsylvania, basically to get a tour and have a beer afterwards. And so it was a camping trip, and we'd go from one day, you know, we went to the Yuengling Brewery in Pottsville, we went to the Lion Brewery in Wilkes-Barre, we went to the Pittsburgh Brewing Company, we went to the Rolling Rock Brewery, and I think we went to 6 breweries altogether.
Okay.
But in between towns, we would see these old brewery buildings that had holes, gaping holes in the side of the building where they had removed fermenting tanks and so forth. And at the end of the week, I said to my friend, you know, we should go around and photograph every standing brewery building in the state. And he looked at me like I was crazy, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
Okay, so this is something you've kind of you've been involved in for some time, even before you made your career change.
Over 30 years, yeah. And so initially on that first week, we would accost people that looked like they were old enough to remember something on the street and say, can you tell us about this old built brewery? And of course people, for some reason, there's something fascinating about beer and breweries, and anybody that lives in a town that had a brewery, it's a kind of a point of pride to them. And so, and in the process, I learned that people do enjoy telling stories either about themselves or about their town or what interests them. Mm-hmm. In the subsequent years, our research became much more library-oriented, historical societies. So instead of just going to the site and looking at the building that was falling down or had been adapted to other uses, we were actually hitting the books, so to speak, and we were like looking at old newspapers. We would go to a community in the local library, usually they have a local history room, and look at old city directories to find, you know, what other breweries that maybe went out of business 100 years earlier. And that's how we get in. That's how I get into these pits of quicksand, because it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
I could definitely see that. It sounds like, too, you've collected a lot of primary sources,
yes.
Whether you're speaking to someone or you're looking at a newspaper clipping.
And I would say in the past 15 years, my research has really dialed into the Philadelphia area. Philadelphia has a wealth of collections, not just what we would call libraries, but collections. You have the Philosophical Society, you have this Historical Society of Pennsylvania, you have the Free Library, and every time I think I've seen all the libraries in Philadelphia, I find out about another one. And I just found out about another collection I didn't know about last night online. I was doing some research, and I find out that the American Institute of Architects has a collection. And really, that's, I think, what captured my imagination when I would find these old breweries was the architecture. And it's industrial architecture, and yet the brewers were rather, I don't know, they were proud of their business, and they had some attention to the aesthetics of their buildings. And then, you just find out that, there were brewery architects, and the one in Philadelphia is named, that's the person I was researching yesterday. I'm writing an article for a magazine called Brewery History, which is published in England. And they're going to put together an issue that's all about breweries in America. So I'm going to do an article on Otto C. Wolff, who had 572 projects to his credit listed in his obituary when he died at the age of 60 in 1916. So he built a brewery in Norway, he built a brewery in Havana, he built, I think I counted he had 248 projects just in Pennsylvania.
Wow. And
about half of those were in Philadelphia. So yeah, there's a whole study of it.
I can definitely see what you mean about the quicksand there. So since we're talking about Philadelphia, can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming presentation?
Well, this got started, I would concentrate on, after gathering a lot of information, then you have to see, well, what am I going to do with this? So I was writing articles for a Breweriana collecting club magazine, and I was thinking, Philadelphia had 100 breweries before 1900 that were all in business at the same time.
Wow.
And 40 of them went out of business before Prohibition, and another 20 of them went out of business, were put out of business by Prohibition. And so there were only a handful, maybe, I forget the exact number, I think it was 17 came back to business after repeal. And then I started looking, 1933, 2 went out of business, 1935, another one went out of business. And I had this idea for a story. It was called Philadelphia Breweries After Repeal, and Then There Were None, with apologies to Agatha Christie, because it was like one of those murder mysteries where you're in this spooky mansion and there's a lightning storm and the lights go out, and all of a sudden when the lights come back up, somebody else has been murdered. And that's what it was. It was like a dominoes, and you hit the domino and they all go. So from 1933 to 1987, Philadelphia just lost one brewery after another until there were none. And the significance of that is, in 1987, I gave my first tour of old brewery buildings in the city. And it was the first time since William Penn's day that there were no breweries in the city. In 1987, from 1685 to 1987, Philadelphia was lousy with breweries. And here in 1987, 300 and some years later, there were none. And there was a vacuum created. And as you know, they tell you in school, nature abhors a vacuum. And so it only took about a year and a half, and somebody opened one of these new craft breweries. It was called a brew pub, and it was called the Samuel Adams Brew House. And it was on around 15th and Sansom Street, right in the shadow of City Hall. And they started out with a 7-barrel system, barrels 31 gallons, so they were making that amount of beer with each batch. And for those of us that were aficionados, if you will, we had after Schmidt's closed, we were saying, when are we going to get a craft brewery or a brew pub in Philadelphia? So when that opened, that was exciting. About a year or year and a half later, the Dock Street Brewery and Restaurant opened at 18th and Cherry, and then it just, we went through a whole new evolution of the craft brewing industry in the city.
Definitely an interesting way to look at the topic, then, to parse it out in that way. So Now, I know you have a book that you've just come out with.
Yes.
How does the book dovetail at all with your presentation?
Oh, yes, yes. And the book really is an outgrowth of presentations that I've created for different time periods on different subjects. And one of the breweries in Philadelphia is called the Philadelphia Brewing Company. And they are actually in an old brewery that went out of business in 1939. It was the Weisbrod and Hess Brewery. And so they have been around for a number of years, and I would set up speaking engagements with them. And I had developed PowerPoint presentations on colonial brewing, breweries during Prohibition, how they survived or how they got tangled up with the law, breweries after repeal, and craft brewing. And so the History Press contacted me and with the idea of doing a book, and I said, well, you only want 160 pages and I have to tell the story of 350 years of brewing. That was my challenge. And so I tried to cover that vast expanse of ground in a short amount of space.
Was it difficult to kind of weed out? Because it sounds like you already had a lot of information and then you just had to kind of fine tune and decide what to leave out.
Well, naturally, I had been dreaming of a book all this time. And I had also, I had given, I think, 18 tours of Philadelphia from 1987 to the present. And what happened during that time was we started having these new craft breweries open. So instead of a bus tour where you say, there's the building that looks like it's about ready to fall down, or here's a building that's been turned into a garage, now we actually could stop and have lunch at an active brewery, or we could stop and see a process tour at Philadelphia Brewing Company or Yards Brewing Company or Independence Brewing Company or Poor Henry's. And so I had written guidebooks to go with my tour. And I had also given tours in Pittsburgh. I had given tours in the Lehigh Valley, in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area, and the area from, say, Harrisburg to Reading. So I had written a number of guidebooks that I self-published. So when I started working on a quote, a real book for the History Press, I had already pretty much digested a lot of this stuff. I had an idea of how I wanted to do it, and they gave me a free rein to set it up as I would.
Nice. Well, it sounds like really the book kind of was already written and it was just a matter of the opportunity.
Exactly. And fact checking and making sure I was on solid ground in anything I said. So.
Now let's rewind a little bit. I know you mentioned that you had gone to brewery school. Where is there a brewery school and what's it like? What kind of curriculum do you have?
In the real olden days, they used to talk about the art and mystery of a craft. So you had the art and mystery of brewing. And so you had to go through an apprenticeship and so forth. Well, as time went on, Louis Pasteur, the microscope, he discovered exactly what yeast was and so forth. And brewing, a lot of the mystery had come out of the craft. Brewing became much more scientific and technically oriented. So in the late 19th century, you had a number of what they called zymotechnic stations set up around the country. I think there were 2 or 3 brewing schools in New York City. There were 3 or 4 in Chicago. And when I went to school in 1994, there was only one of these old schools left over, and that was the Siebel Institute of Technology in Chicago. So I had some time off from work. I took the train, I took the Broadway Limited out to Chicago, and I spent 10 weeks, full class, full days. It was just like it was going to school, and 2 or 3 classes before lunch, 2 or 3 classes after lunch, and it covered everything you would need to know to have get the book learning or the education associated with the industry. And one of the things that I found fascinating was this was when there was a lot of interest. A lot of these craft breweries were opening and so forth. And so we had like the largest class that they had ever had. We had 45. And I forget, we had like people from 8 different countries, I think, at least, that were represented. And people from the big breweries, from Coors and Miller and Well, Anheuser-Busch has their own school, so they don't send people to Siebel, but we had people from Korea, we had people from Brazil, and the Netherlands from Heineken, and it was a real, networking fiesta, if you will. In addition to learning all this stuff, you also got to talk to people, and of course during classes somebody would say, well, this is how we do it, or we've had this problem with this. So it was very stimulating. It was very exciting for me, because that's one of the things that drew me to want to go into the industry, was when I discovered people from the industry and the way they talked about their industry, of how serious they were and how scientific and technical it was. And I had been a science teacher, so that's part of the thing that dovetailed with my, former life, if you will.
Yeah, so I can see there's a lot of commonality. You kind of segued from one into the next.
Exactly.
Okay. So now, I know you're talking about the mystery and the art versus the science, but I know you also do a lot of colonial brewing demonstrations.
Yes.
So how did you get involved in that?
Well, the Pennsbury Manor is a state historic site on the Delaware in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. I think it's about 15 miles north of the city, Philadelphia. And they had a garden. They had a beautiful garden, a classical English herb garden. And I said, you have a bacon brew house here. Why don't we can't you grow some hops? So I worked with the gardener. I set up a hop trellis, and they started to grow hops. And then after the first harvest, they took me into the bacon brew house, and they had like a little oven or a kiln, if you will, and that's where we dried the hops. So that was the first time they had fired up the brick encased boiler or whatever, the fire in that bacon brew house for many, many years. On the bake side, they had done laundry and they had done a lot of baking things, but they had never really fired up the brew house side. So a year or so later, they had a cooper, a person who makes barrels and tubs with staves and hoops, from Connecticut, make them some reproductions of the kind of equipment that would have been used during Penn's day.